I'm Tony Northrup, and this is your free tutorial for the Canon EOS R5. Please subscribe to our channel. It's totally free and it helps to support us in making these expensive, long format, but really helpful videos. If you want a tutorial for a different camera, maybe you want to send this to your friends, send them to sdp.io/tutorials, where we have tutorials for more than 50 popular cameras. This video has a table of contents that you can find in the description, and you can scrub through and kind of see where you are. That way you can quickly return to something or pick up where you left off that you might not get through it in one sitting. Another useful way to find information quickly is to look up the EOS R5 manual online at sdp.io/R5 manual. It is 925 pages, and I read it so you don't have to. I'm not going to teach you everything in the manual, just those things that I think are going to be useful and important to you. But pull this up on your phone, save it. It should give you the option, like you can save it in iBooks, and then later you can go back and search for something, because it can be kind of hard to find specific features in the menu system. You might remember that it can do something, but can't remember exactly how to do it. Quickly search that manual when you're out and about, and it'll help you out. First of all, you should update the firmware on your camera. Canon regularly releases firmware updates that fix bugs or add new features. There is no automatic update feature on this. It's not going to pop up a notification saying there's a new firmware update like every other device in your life. This is a very 1990s, early 2000s experience. You need to Google Canon EOS R5 firmware update, go to the Canon webpage, download it, extract the file, copy it to an SD card, put it in your camera, and then choose the firmware update process. The lenses get updates too, and just about all of my lenses have already had at least one firmware update, so search for each of the lens models and install those. If you want notifications for it, follow canonrumors.com. I subscribe to them in my newsfeed, and they're pretty good about telling you about new firmware updates. First of all, the batteries on this are gonna be a little bit of a problem. Depending on how you're shooting and what your settings are, battery life can be anywhere from acceptable to really bad. This does USB-C charge, however, and that can be a lifesaver. That means you can just plug it in when you get back home and charge it up like you do your smartphone, and it's kind of always ready. That's what I recommend doing. But not all USB-C chargers will charge it. So test a USB-C charger before you plan to charge it in the field. Like my MacBook Pro charger works to charge it no problem. My car USB-C charger will charge it, but other USB-C chargers won't charge it, and I actually took it on a trip one time and then couldn't charge it. You don't want that to happen to you. The R5 is backwards compatible with older Canon batteries, such as those that you might have for your 5D Mark IV. However, it's only the newer ones that have the little hologram there that will allow you to USB-C charge it. So if you're reusing your 5D Mark IV batteries, you could forget about USB-C charging. I would strongly suggest buying at least one extra genuine Canon battery, if not two batteries, because it will run out and you will be left stranded, especially if you're a heavy shooter, if you're planning on going out and shooting all day. If you're a pro shooter, you're probably gonna run out of batteries. If you're shooting video, get extra batteries. When you go and you look for batteries for this camera, you will see a bunch of third-party batteries. We have tried, I don't know, half a dozen different brands of third-party batteries. The life expectancy for those batteries, the useful life, is about 6 months. If you get an actual Canon battery, we find the life expectancy to be about 2 years. They all eventually wear out, but the third-party ones wear out much faster. And the third-party ones will show as 100%, and then 10 minutes into shooting later, they will be blinking empty. So light users won't even notice a problem, and that's why they get so many good reviews. But serious users will be left stranded, and I don't want that to happen to you. If you want better battery life, here are some settings that you can change. In order to show you the menus on the camera, I'm going to connect a Micro-HDMI connector to a field recorder to this camera. And you can see the Micro-HDMI is a very flaky connection, so I'm having to use this screw-on setup that Canon provides in the box. The first setting to check is the display performance. So hit the menu button, and then you'll see the way I notate this is camera 8. Camera is that camera looking icon, and 8 means page 8. So we'll scroll over here and then go to display performance. Select display performance and choose power saving. Now smooth is nice. If you're not worried about battery on that day, go ahead and use smooth. It's especially great for action, but it does burn through the batteries much faster. So display performance power saving can really help you out. Another option you should choose is the airplane mode. This is under the Wi-Fi settings here. The second one down, airplane mode, put that to on. If you've never turned on Wi-Fi, that's not going to make any difference. But if you have turned on Wi-Fi and forgotten to turn it off, the camera in the background will keep churning, trying to transfer files, and will burn through your batteries even when the camera is powered off. So by default, I prefer to turn airplane mode on to just stop all of that Wi-Fi communications. Another setting you might check is under the wrench icon, page 2. Go down to eco mode here and turn that on. That will just use a little bit less power. While you're there, you might also check out the power savings options, which control just how long the camera stays on after you've stopped using it. The default settings are okay, but you can always turn those down to save a little bit more power if that's something you're struggling with. The biggest tip for reducing power usage is to turn the camera off every single time you're done using it. Just get in the habit of flicking it off every time. Here are some tips for DSLR users, such as those upgrading from the Canon 5D Mark IV. The biggest difference in shooting is going to be using this rear screen. On the Canon 5D Mark IV, it wasn't all that useful. Like turning it on required you to use a completely different focusing system that didn't focus nearly as fast. Earlier cameras didn't even have a touchscreen. This has an incredibly versatile screen that can flip out from the side, and you can tilt it like this if you want to shoot down low and don't have to lay in the grass in order to see through the viewfinder, or if you need to shoot over crowds or something, tilt it down like this. If you're doing product photography, instead of being behind the camera and looking through the viewfinder, flip that screen forward, and then you can get right over here where the product is and manipulate it and get the shot lined up and trigger the camera from the front. And that just allows you to get more done a little bit quicker. The quickest way to select a specific focusing point if the camera isn't focusing where you want is to just turn the touchscreen on, and then it's just pull your face away from the camera so the rear screen comes on, and then just touch a part of the screen. And that will immediately snap into focus and start tracking. So forget using the thumbstick. Get in the habit of using the rear screen and your workflow will be much faster. Another opportunity this rear screen presents is some just blank space. Head over to sdp.io/sticker, where I have a free PDF that you can download and print. Put something there. You have this big blank space here. I like to put little notes to myself, reminders of things I need to do, because in the heat of the moment, when you're getting the best picture of your career, you will forget something and then you'll be kicking yourself later. You could also put your name and phone number and address in case your camera's lost and a good Samaritan wants to return it to you. There's also this rear space here, which I like to put a sticker there so that only I can see it when I flip the camera open. Because the screen flips around, you can also protect the screen when you throw it in your bag. So flip it like this, and that way the screen won't get scratched when you're being rough with it. On the top of the camera, you have a little light bulb icon, and I want to show that to you. Push this once and it switches modes, showing you different information. Press it and hold it, and it reverses the polarity of that LED screen, so you might be able to see it a little more clearly. Let's talk about the ports on the camera. They're all really clearly labeled. Thank you, Canon, for making it obvious which ports are what on the side. If you ever have to use this bottom port here, there's something going wrong in your life. This is a PC sync port, and it is meant to connect to flashes that date back to like the 1910s. It's a very outdated system. The cable comes loose very, very easily. The proper way to connect to a flash is always through the hot shoe. Even if you have to use a hot shoe to PC sync, it's probably an easier thing to do than connecting to this outdated port. Above that, you'll see standard headphone and microphone jack connectors. On the other side here, we have connectors for HDMI and USB. The bottom one is the HDMI port, and that's what I was using to record the screen with earlier. HDMI outputs a video feed, just like from your cable box to your TV. It will either output the video that the camera is recording, or it will output the menus, depending on how you have it configured. It will not output 8K video. The most you can output through HDMI on this camera is 4K. This is a micro HDMI port, which means it sucks. Regular HDMI is a much bigger connector. The micro HDMI is very small and will come loose while you're trying to use it. That's why Canon provides you this kludgy thing. Like first they give you a small port and then they give you this hacky thing just to make it work. It's okay. It gets the job done, and I'm going to be using it throughout this video. Right above that, you see a USB-C connector. You can use this top port to transfer files or to charge it. If you forget your memory card reader, go ahead, jack right in there and you should be able to transfer the files. You might have to install software, but it should install automatically. I'm going to talk about the memory cards now. This camera has 2 memory cards. You should always be using both of them. The bigger port here is CF Express Type B. I don't currently have one in there because Chelsea is using the CF Express Type B card in a different camera. The other port is the traditional SD card. SD cards are super inexpensive but real slow. CF Express Type B cards are very expensive but very fast. So you should get at least one of both. This is an asymmetric configuration. One is fast, one is slow, but memory cards fail. Some people think CF Express cards don't fail because they're so reliable, or Canon cameras don't ever have corruption problems. We have had plenty of the best memory cards in the best cameras fail. Failures are inevitable with storage. That is why they provide you 2 cards, so you can get an instant backup by writing to both cards simultaneously, and you should always be doing that. But because the 2 cards are asymmetric, because they're different speeds, you are going to get bogged down. If you are writing raw 50 megapixel pictures to that slow SD card, it's going to run out of buffer, and your shooting is going to slow way down. So what I do is I write raw files to the CF Express card and JPEG files to the SD card. If the CF Express card fails, I only have the JPEG files to fall back on, but generally those JPEG files are good enough and it doesn't slow me down. If you're shooting slowly and you don't find the SD card performance to be a problem, by all means, write raw files to both cards, and we'll talk about raw versus JPEG in just a second. To set this up, go into the menu system, wrench page 1, and then we're going to go to record function and folder selection. The second option here, record options for still photos, select it and then select record to multiple. That will mean it writes to both cards simultaneously. You're going to want to buy a real big CF Express Type B card because 50 megapixels at 20 frames per second will fill that card up so fast, especially if you're shooting RAW. I suggest getting a 256 gigabyte card so you're not stuck with no more memory out in the field. You can go to sdp.io/bigcfx to see my recommendations, but I like the SanDisk Extreme Pro. If you plan to use the 8K RAW video feature, which is excellent, but it records incredibly huge files at high bandwidth, you need a card that can write at 1500 megabytes per second. Sometimes you'll see the bandwidth written in megabits per second. There are 8 bits to a byte. So make sure you look for megabytes. It's written with a capital B there. For the SD card, you want to make sure you get a fast UHS 2 SD card. They are much less expensive, but you should still get a large one. If you're only writing JPEGs to that second card, you can get a smaller card, but they're so inexpensive and you already dropped $3,900 on a camera, you might as well get a 256 gig card. The next suggestion will save you. You will either be writing me a note saying, you saved me, or you'll be writing me a note saying, I should have listened to you and I was stuck in the field with no memory cards. You will be pulling memory cards out of your camera at times to copy the files to your computer. And at some point in the future, you're going to forget, unless you're a perfect human being, which I am not. My suggestion is to buy the cheapest memory cards possible and buy half a dozen or a dozen of them, and then spread them around your life. Put one in the glove compartment of your car. Put one in your purse or your wife's purse or your office desk, anywhere where you might be taking pictures in the future. Keep several in your camera bag so one you can toss to a friend who got stuck out there. This link at sdp.io/extrasd is a link to an extremely inexpensive memory card. It is not a great memory card. It is better than nothing though. If you want to format the card, that is also located on the Wrench 1 page. Formatting erases all the contents of the memory card and makes it ready to use. You don't generally have to format it before you use it. I do not format the memory card every single time I unload it. I'll copy the pictures to my computer and then I leave the pictures on there unless I absolutely have to delete them. That way the memory card is actually acting as a backup. Because I've had this happen, you copy the files to your computer and then your computer's hard drive fails before it gets a chance to back itself up. Especially when you're traveling where you might not be getting real-time backups, having the backup in camera can really help you out. Traveling, you might get your laptop stolen or something. The sensor can get dust on it, and that will show up in your pictures, especially pictures at higher f-stops such as f22. The cleaning kit I recommend is available at these links, and you can check our channel for a video on how to clean your sensor. To activate cleaning mode, go to Wrench page 4 and go down to Sensor Cleaning. You'll see it has an automatic cleaning mode where it just shakes the sensor a little bit. Then when it's done, it does not cover the sensor. It leaves the sensor exposed and locked and ready to clean. Now you can take those swabs that I just mentioned and get all the dust off of it. You don't have to do this unless you see a problem. Let's talk about lenses. A lot of you are coming from one of the Canon DSLRs, such as a 5D. You have a bunch of Canon DSLR EF lenses. They will work excellent on the Canon R5, but you need an adapter. You need this EF to RF adapter linked here. It goes for about $100. Canon has several different models. One you can drop in filters on. I don't find that particularly useful. I don't want to buy separate filters just for my adapted lenses. I'd rather just use screw-on filters for everything. The other one has a control ring on the adapter itself. I don't like it because that adapter, the control ring is so close to the camera that I just find it difficult to use. Thus, I just use the cheap adapter. You should upgrade to RF lenses when you have the budget for it, because the RF lenses work better, they're quicker, and the quality is generally much better. They're also smaller and lighter, and they're designed for this camera system. If you decide to sell your lenses, we have a partner, KEH, who makes buying and selling used gear very, very easy, no risk of scams. So check out these links, stp.io/sell now to sell your gear with the coupon code TNCSELL for an extra 5% bonus, or stp.io/buy now with the coupon code TNCSHOP for a 5% discount. Let's talk about the Q button on the back of the camera here. When you press it, you're going to get a shortcut menu. This shortcut menu makes it really easy to change a bunch of different settings. So the next time you think, oh, I need to change something, just hit Q and it's probably there. This isn't really customizable. It just provides ready access to the things that most photographers need quick access to. Another quick way to change things is this MFN button on the front right here. So just punch that and you can see, without interrupting the shooting screen, you have the ability to switch between a bunch of different settings. Use the dial on the back to control which setting, and then use the dial on the front to control the actual value. So you can see, to change the ISO, I could just hit MFN, scroll to ISO here, and then do this. If you want to switch between stills and video mode, it works differently than on other Canon cameras. First I hit mode, and it's in stills mode, so I'll hit info, and it switches to video mode, info, goes back to stills mode. And you can see I can switch between the actual modes by just scrolling my thumb here. Just like your DSLRs, this camera supports all the traditional modes, like program, aperture priority, shutter priority, manual mode. You can learn about how to use each of these at these links to free videos. It also supports a whole new type of mode called flexible priority. This is labeled as FV. FV allows you to freely control shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, determining which of each is set manually or automatically. It completely replaces all those other modes. So go into FV mode, set all those settings to auto, and you're in program mode. If you then want to take control over the aperture to set a specific depth of field, you can do that and just control that one setting. Decide you also need to control shutter speed, you can do that without having to change the mode. It's all you ever need to use, so I'm going to show you how to use it really quickly. Hit the mode button and then scroll over to FV. Now you can see at the bottom, all those settings are set to auto. The front dial here controls exposure compensation, so I can control the relative brightness of the image based on the automatic settings. If I want to change any of those other settings, the easiest thing to do is to simply touch them on the touchscreen. I can also use the back dial to select which of those settings is highlighted. By using the back dial to scroll over to TV, now I can use the front dial to manually set the shutter speed. I can now scroll over to aperture and manually set the aperture. To reset it to auto, select it at the back and then press the trash can button. If you've jacked up all of your settings and you want to reset everything, just hold down the trash can button and everything goes back to full auto. When you go into the modes, there's a bunch of modes there, and you might only ever want to use FV and bulb mode or FV and C1. You can limit that so you don't see so many and have to scroll through so many. Hit the menu button, go over to the custom menu at the top, which is this setting, and then go to page 2. Go down to restrict shooting modes. It's currently off. I'm going to select enable, and then you can see it says Q detail set. So push the Q button on the back of your camera and choose which of these you want to see. I'm going to use FV for everything. So I'm going to turn off program, shutter priority, aperture priority, manual. I'm still going to sometimes use bulb mode for exposures longer than 30 seconds, and I will definitely use C2 and C3, which I'll show you later. So I'll click OK here. Now when I push the mode button, you can see I can skip right past those other ones. They're still on the screen, but they're grayed out, so it makes life a little bit faster. The viewfinder is still incredibly useful on mirrorless cameras. It blocks out everything. And in fact, with this viewfinder, you can now review your pictures and record video and look through here to see the whole rest of the world blocked out, even in bright sun. If you look through it and things are blurry, that's because your diopter has moved. This is like the glasses prescription built right into the viewfinder. Nobody really has perfect vision, so you might have to adjust this a little bit. Or if you hand it to somebody else, they might have to adjust it so they can see it clearly. Simply hold it up to your eye, look at the numbers on the screen, the digital numbers, not through the lens, and move it up or down until everything is sharp. Something else that's tricky is the lock button on the top of the camera. When you press this, everything is locked. When things are locked, you can still use the main dial on the front of the camera, but every other dial is locked and you'll just see that lock message. Just push lock again to unlock it. I've hit it accidentally and been frantically trying to change things and not been able to do it, so I wanted to show you where that button was. Now let's talk about the different types of shutters on this camera. We basically have 3 different shutter modes: electronic, electronic first curtain shutter, and mechanical. Most of the time, you can use just straight up electronic and be in great shape. Electronic does not move the mechanical click-clack shutter. Thus, your shooting can be completely silent and you are adding no wear and tear to this mechanical shutter. To choose your shutter mode, go into the menu system, go to the camera menu, page 6, and then choose shutter mode, and you'll see your 3 options here. Electronic also gives you access to the full 20 frames per second. Otherwise, you are limited to 12 frames per second when you have a full battery. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. So why would you not use electronic all the time if it's silent and faster and doesn't incur any mechanical wear? Here are some examples. One is the presence of additional rolling shutter. Rolling shutter causes straight lines to appear diagonal when the camera is panning or when the subject itself is moving quickly from left to right across the frame. Here is a panning shot at a football field where vertical goalposts were turned a little bit diagonal because I was using an electronic shutter. This is an example from my book, Stunning Digital Photography. So if you read it, you already know this stuff. Electronic shutter can also induce banding with artificial lights, which is going to be really important for those of you shooting indoor sports. Exactly how much banding you get will depend on the lights and your shutter speed. But here's an example at 1/500th of a second, which is actually kind of slow for sports. On the left, you see a photo taken with the Canon EOS R5 with the mechanical shutter. There appears to be no banding. On the right, you can see some distinct banding. This sort of banding can ruin your indoor sports photos or any indoor shot under artificial light. The banding becomes less and less at lower shutter speeds. So if you're shooting a birthday party at 1/60th, it probably will not be a problem at all. But it depends also on the lights. So a mechanical shutter under artificial lights is always safer. As you go into faster shutter speeds, like you might do for sports and action, the difference becomes even greater. But you will still see some banding even with the mechanical shutter. On the left, we see an example of 1/1000th of a second with some distinct banding. And on the right, we see just how bad the banding is with the electronic shutter, much worse. And at 1/2000th of a second, you can see it's completely unbearable with the electronic shutter. And with the mechanical shutter, it's unbearable too. But you can see the light pulsed a full 3 times with the mechanical shutter, whereas it pulsed about 30 times with the electronic shutter. There is the option for anti-flicker. Go into the menus and look under Camera, page 2, and you'll see Anti-Flicker Shoot. It's currently disabled because I'm on electronic shutter, but if you have it on mechanical or electronic first curtain shutter, you should be able to select it. It does not eliminate flickering, but it can help just a little bit. Honestly, in our testing, I never found a situation where anti-flicker actually made things better, but what it will do is delay the shutter firing just a tiny bit so that it's firing when the light is not flashing, but it's only going to help you at slower shutter speeds, really. Your third option, electronic first curtain shutter, brings most of the benefits of the mechanical shutter by only using the mechanical shutter for the second half of the exposure. It opens the exposure with the electronic shutter and then closes it with the mechanical shutter. That should be enough to reduce the banding and the rolling shutter, but it makes the camera steadier by not shaking the camera at the beginning of the exposure by moving the mechanical shutter. So especially for things like landscapes where you want the ultimate in sharpness, or if you're on a tripod, definitely choose electronic first curtain shutter over mechanical shutter. The shutter mode will determine how many frames per second you can get with the camera. Electronic shutter maxes out at 20 frames per second when you're in high plus mode. So to switch to high plus mode, I'll hit the Q button here, go down to the drive mode here, and now you can see I can scroll over to high speed continuous plus. That will give me 20 frames per second with electronic shutter. See it flashing there? Every time it flashes, that's another picture taken. You can bet with 50 megapixel RAW, you're going to fill up your memory card real fast. If you switch to a mechanical shutter, watch how this changes. Still very fast, but now it's down to 12 frames per second when I have a full battery. The Canon R5 requires 60% or more of the battery for it to shoot at the max frame rate. It just needs more juice. If the battery drops to half, it's going to drop down to 9 frames per second. So you're not going to be getting nearly as many pictures. Or if it gets really low, it's going to be closer to 7 frames per second. If you're shooting sports or action, remember to bring extra batteries and don't wait until they're dead. Swap them out early and often to maximize your frames per second. These cameras often beep by default, so I want to show you how to turn that off. Hit the menu button, go up to the wrench icon and go to page 2. Now go to the beep and just select disable. Let's talk about back button focus. I have a whole video dedicated to why you should do this at sdp.io/YBB. What you do is you decouple the focusing from the front shutter button here. Now you can take pictures with the front shutter button and the camera does not autofocus unless you specifically tell it to by pushing one of the buttons on the back with your thumb. I'm going to show you how I configure the Canon EOS R5 for back button focus. First, I'll hit the Q button here and I'll go to AF operation and select servo. That's continuous AF. That's my favorite way to focus with this camera. On other cameras, you might be choosing one shot because it's more accurate, but this is incredibly accurate even with servo, so there's no reason to not use it all the time. Next, I'll go into the menu system and I'm going to disable eye autofocus. Eye autofocus on this camera is amazing, but I don't want it to be on by default. I want it to be on when I activate it manually using a separate button. So eye detection, disable. Now I'm going to program the back buttons and the shutter button by going to the custom menu here, page 3, and do customize buttons. On the shutter button here, by default, it's going to say metering and AF start. Set this to just metering start. Next, I'm going to scroll down to the AF on button, and I'm going to select this and set it to eye detection AF. When this is selected and I push the AF on button, it will look for an eye in the frame. This is a really good default thing to do. It's capable of finding humans, birds, other types of animals, and it works fantastically. Next, I'll go down to the little star icon here. Normally this is set to just metering start. I find that useless. So instead I'm going to set it to metering and AF start right here. And then I'm going to hit the info button and program it in a custom way. You can see this allows me to configure it for specific behaviors whenever I push this asterisk button. I'm going to set AF operation to servo, the AF method to spot AF, and if I wanted to customize it further, I could. Okay, I'm going to need something to focus on, so I have tiny me here. When I push AF on, you can see it focuses on the eye of the subject. Now I can snap pictures really quickly. What if I want to focus on something different? Well, I can push the asterisk button and it will activate the center autofocus point, and then I can just release it to take pictures wherever I want. So now I can easily tell it to focus on different parts of the frame. We've already covered a lot of custom settings and more will come. You might find that you want different settings for landscapes and sports photography, and changing between servo and one shot and all these different modes can take too long. That's why you should capture a group of settings as C1, C2, and C3, which are separate modes other than like manual, shutter priority, aperture priority. Set your camera up in however you want it, and then go into the menus, go to the wrench menu, page 5, and select custom shooting mode, C1 to C3. And now you can register settings as one of those 3 modes. Let's do this quickly. I'm in FV mode. I'm going to hold down the trash can button to reset everything. Now I'm using the back button to scroll over to shutter priority, and I'm going to set this to 1/2000th of a second. We're going to call this my sports mode. Now menu, custom shooting mode, register settings, C1, OK. Now let's do a portrait mode. Hold down the trash can again until everything is reset. Now let's set the aperture wide open and set the shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. I'm also going to give it just 2/3 of a stop exposure compensation because I find it tends to underexpose faces just a little bit. I like these settings for portraits, so let's register these as C2. Now I just finished a portrait shoot. I want to go back to sports. I'm going to hit the mode button, scroll over to C1. There we are, 1/2000th of a second. Okay, suddenly it's time for another portrait session after the game, taking pictures of the winning athletes. I'm back into portrait mode with my original settings. Especially useful if you're out in the field doing astrophotography or something unusual and you screw up 20 different settings and you just want to get it back to normal, just reset it. If you're like a husband and wife team, like my wife and I are, and you're switching cameras between the two of you, you can be C1 and they can be C2, etc. If you have all these settings and you get them right, you might get a backup body, or you might replace the body or send it off to Canon for service and get a loaner camera. You should save your settings to the memory card. Hit the menu button, wrench page 5, save load, and then select save to card. It saves it. Later you can go back to that same menu option and choose load from card. Obviously you can't be in C1. These videos are so much work. My voice already hurts. You can do something to thank us for putting out this free content instead of charging for it, and that's subscribe to the channel completely free. Give this video a like, recommend sdp.io/tutorials to your friends. That helps build our channel. But you can also support us by buying some of our educational materials. That's really how we make a living here. We have a lot of books out there. Here's 4 photography related books. The Photography Buying Guide has detailed information about cameras, lenses, which gear you should get to supplement your Canon camera, flashes, tripods, all of that. The Photoshop book has over 10 hours of video in it that will teach you how to use the most important post-processing app. And that will do wonders for your photography, way more than getting a new lens or something. For organizing all those thousands of photos that you get at 20 frames per second, check out our Lightroom Classic book. We still recommend the app Lightroom Classic as your main photo editing and organizing app over standard Lightroom. Don't get standard Lightroom. It's too expensive. Makes it like you store all your stuff in the cloud. And the #1 photography book of the last decade, Stunning Digital Photography, includes over 20 hours of video now, practices, quizzes, everything you need to go from complete beginner to absolute pro. And if you already feel like you're pretty good, we have some content for you professional shooters out there, like our Taking and Selling Portrait Photography video training series, The Art and Science of Photography, which goes way deeper than we can on YouTube. And finally, to quickly make your photos better in Lightroom or Lightroom Classic, check out our preset packs, technical presets that will allow you to take the dynamic range further than you could without them, as well as creative preset packs that will make your photos beautiful in just a couple of clicks. Everything's available at northrup.photo or this link here. They start at $10, so you don't have to be rich to get it. Now I'm going to quickly just show you the info button. You can push the info button on the back and it will rotate between different sets of information. For example, if you just want to see your settings, here you are. You can hide all of your settings and be creative with your composition, or anywhere in between. If you don't like switching between so many different screens, hit the menu button, go to Camera, page 7. The last option is Shooting Info DISP. Under that option, you can select which of those pages you see, and you can even add a secret 6th option, which turns the screen completely off. That can be useful if you're shooting a dim concert and your screen is actually too bright. You can also control the information that you see in the viewfinder when you rotate between them, because hitting info with your eye to the viewfinder will have a different effect. You can turn a grid on. You can control whether the histogram shows brightness or separate red, blue, and green variations. I just like brightness. You can also choose whether it shows you the focusing distance in manual focus mode, just when focusing, or always. You probably already know about RAW versus JPEG. Despite what my friend Jared says, there are definitely times to choose both JPEG and RAW. If you're out shooting sports, you're probably going to nail the exposure. You don't need to worry about correcting massive amounts of shadow or highlights. Just shoot JPEG. Save yourself a bunch of storage space. Don't fill up your card so fast. To change these settings, go into the menu system, go to camera page 1. It's the very first option. That's how important it is. And you can see by using the front dial here, I can choose between not recording RAW, or recording CRAW. CRAW is a compressed version of the RAW file that will be substantially smaller and loses very little detail. It's kind of a compromise between RAW and JPEG in that it has slightly lower quality, but still excellent quality and doesn't take up nearly as much space. You can also use the back dial to select how sharp you want the JPEG files to be. This smooth large is going to produce the highest quality. These variations will drop down in megapixels, as well as the compression level used on JPEG. JPEG is like a decades old format. It's incredibly outdated. This camera also supports HEIF files, H-E-I-F. If you have an iPhone, that's what your iPhone uses by default. Lightroom supports it now. It's become a pretty popular format. It allows higher levels of compression and higher quality. Instead of recording just 8 bits of color, 256 variations, it will record 1024. It's a 10-bit format. If you want to use HEIF, it's not exactly obvious how you get there. Go into the menu systems, go to camera page 2, and then select HDR PQ settings. Very confusingly named, right? HDR picture quality. So select enable here, and now you're using HEIF files. Doesn't make that obvious, but go back to camera page 1, select this, and now you can see on the bottom row here, instead of saying JPEG, it says HEIF. Please test HEIF in your actual workflow before you do a production shoot with it. It should work fine. They should import into Lightroom just fine. But if you use a different editing app, you might find that it chokes on the HEIF files and it just can't handle it. In the camera, you might see settings for dual pixel RAW. It's this very cool concept where the camera records twice as much information, producing a RAW file twice as big, where you could use Canon's utilities to, in theory, shift focus afterwards. I've tested this so much, and I've been completely unable to produce any scenario in the real world where it's useful. I just wanted to save you the time. Never bother with dual pixel RAW, just ignore it. There, I just saved you an hour of fiddling that you can spend checking out stunning digital photography or the art and science of photography. A useful feature is the crop and aspect ratio. That's because it's 2021 and a lot of us are publishing our work on formats with different aspect ratios, such as Instagram, which uses vertical 8:10. Or maybe you're making 8:10 portraits for a client or shooting a magazine cover. Maybe you want to shoot square. This is all very realistic. Hit the menu button, camera page 1. The third option down is cropping aspect ratio. Select that, and for example, maybe you want to do square shooting, select 1:1. And now we can see here, I have the edges masked off. This makes it much easier to fill the frame, compose a perfect shot. Go into video mode, that option disappears. You cannot crop 1:1 in video mode, you'll have to do it in post. The interval timer, otherwise known as an intervalometer, causes the camera to take a picture every 1 second, 10 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever, to create a time lapse. This can be super useful for time-lapse photographers, or if you just want to leave the camera, set it and forget it in case you're trying to capture lightning or shooting stars or something. I'll show you how to do it. Hit the menu button, go to camera page 6, interval timer, enable. And now you can see at the bottom, info detail set. So I'll hit the info button. This allows me to specify the interval. For example, taking a picture every 10 seconds. Let's make that 7 seconds and 2 minutes, and then how many shots to take. I'll scroll down to 0 and it will be unlimited. It'll just keep shooting until I turn the camera off. That's pretty much what I always do. Actually, I want to demonstrate this. So let's set it to 3 seconds and select OK. And if you want it to be silent, you can set it to electronic here. Why would you want to do this? If I have a particularly cool hotel room with a nice view, I'll set the camera up when I go to bed so that I can get a time lapse of the sunrise without me actually having to wake up and start it. But I don't want to be woken up by going clink, clink, clink every 3 seconds. Set it to electronic, it operates completely silently, capturing all the pictures that I want. Now, when I go back to shooting mode by half pressing the shutter, I'll just push the shutter button and you can see it's waiting 3 seconds, it's shooting again, waiting 3 seconds, shooting again. Oh, I could do a little stop motion. And now to stop it, I'm just going to turn the camera off. I want to show you the focus magnifier, which is particularly useful when manually focusing. It's the magnifying glass button on the back of your camera. When I press it, it's not going to let me do it because I'm in autofocus mode with face tracking on. So I'll switch over to manual mode on the lens, and then bam, I push it and I zoom in. And that means I can get it manually focused on the eye nice and tight, And then I can push it to zoom in even further. It goes from 6 times to 15 times. And this really helps me nail the focus on this still subject. And then when I'm ready, I can take a picture and know that I locked focus. When you're ready to review pictures, push the play button on the back of the camera. This is super intuitive. You can quickly scroll through pictures with your thumb and zoom in by pinching and pulling. Get used to using your fingers. It's so much easier than trying to use the thumbstick. Hit the info button to show different sets of information. Something I love to do is to call photos in the field. When I find a photo I like, I'll hit the rate button and rate it 3, 4, 5 stars. That way, when I import the photos into Lightroom Classic, I can quickly filter and just find those photos I liked in the field, get them back to the client a little bit faster. If you use voice memos, something 1DX users will be familiar with, just hold that rate button down. And now you can see it says recording memo. So it'll be recording anything I say, and it creates a separate WAV file. No tool really makes the memo easy to access. So I don't recommend starting using that tool, but if you've used it on other cameras, I wanted to show you where it was. I also like to quickly erase bad photos so that I don't ever import them onto my computer. So if I find a picture I really don't like, hit the erase button and then select erase. If you don't want to have to manually scroll over to erase every time, you can make erase the default option. Open up the menus, go to the custom menu, page 4, and then you'll see default erase option. Set it to erase selected. You might also want to turn off the auto review feature, which automatically reviews pictures immediately after you take them. This consumes a lot of batteries, and in a DSLR, it was so important to check your exposure. But with a mirrorless camera, you're generally seeing the exposure as you take the picture, so you don't need it. Go into the menus, go under the camera, page 7, and then under image review, it says review duration, set this to off. If you do want to review your pictures, you can actually review them in the viewfinder, so you don't have to pull your face away from the camera. Here's an unrelated option that I just find super important. It's turning off the ability to take pictures without a card. Because, as I mentioned earlier, inevitably you're going to forget your card. And the camera will let you take pictures. And I've actually started a little photo shoot only to realize later that I didn't have my card because it's easy to ignore warning messages nowadays, right? So go to camera, page 6, and you'll see release shutter without card. Set that to disable. This way, if you don't have a card in the camera, your camera will refuse to take pictures, which seems like the right thing to do. When you're in a studio and you have the camera connected to studio lights, obviously the camera will not be previewing the exposure correctly because it doesn't know what the flashes are going to do. If you connect a Canon flash or a third-party flash or strobe created for Canon, the camera will detect the presence of that flash and stop previewing your exposure. The viewfinder will start to work like a DSLR where you just sort of see things, but they don't reflect the actual exposure in post. This is really useful. If you were to preview the exposure that would be taken with strobes, it would be very dark since the strobes would be providing all the light, and thus you wouldn't be able to see through the viewfinder to do things like focus and compose your shot. So you don't want that exposure free preview in flash situations. If you don't get that, for example, if you're using that PC sync port, you will have to manually turn this on. I want to show you where that is. Go into the menus, go to camera page 7, and then select exposure simulation and set that to disable. Exposure simulation previews the exposure it thinks it's going to get. If the viewfinder is dark, set that to disable. Now I want to talk about bulb mode. In manual mode, shutter priority, you can set the shutter time to a maximum of 30 seconds. There might be times where you want to expose for 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, like light painting or something. In these situations, go into the mode settings and go to bulb mode. Now what you do is you just hold the shutter down with your finger for 5, 10 minutes, however long you need. Okay, this seems dumb, right? Because clearly you have the camera on a tripod, your finger's probably going to be shaking the camera. Bad idea. What you should do instead is to use a remote trigger. The Canon BRE1 is my recommended way to trigger the shutter. It's wireless, so you need to pair it through Bluetooth and take your camera out of airplane mode. Put your camera into bulb mode. Push the trigger on it once to open the shutter, and a second time, after your timer has gone off, to close the shutter. Another quick ad for a store in case you're skipping around. We have the world's best photography education training at incredibly low prices, starting at under $10, like Stunning Digital Photography, the world's best-selling photography book, our Lightroom and Photoshop training, video training series, like the Art and Science of Photography and the Professional Portrait Training series. These will take your photography next level. They'll do way more for you than more cameras and lenses and tripods and stuff, and they help support in-depth training like this and to keep it free. So head over to northrup.photo, our store, and check out some of our stuff to say thank you. Also, don't forget to subscribe. And if you do get into post-processing and you want to use Lightroom Classic, the one I recommend, as well as Photoshop, you can use our affiliate link here, sdp.io/Adobe Deal. This camera supports a few different modes of wirelessly transferring your pictures. You can use the Wi-Fi app to transfer photos to your smartphone. You can transfer them to the image.canon cloud service via Wi-Fi, or you can even transfer them to your own private FTP server on your local network. These all work pretty well, but I'm going to make a separate tutorial since these functions are pretty similar across many different Canon cameras, and I'm getting super tired. So to see that in the future at some point, head to sdp.io/tutorial and you'll see it listed under there. In the meantime, I don't actually use the wireless transfer that much. Instead, I transfer my files the old-fashioned way by taking the memory card out and putting it into a memory card reader. If I want to transfer them into a tablet or my smartphone while traveling, for example, I just use a USB SD card reader and pull it directly into Lightroom on my phone. These links take you to readers designed for the Apple iPhone or for Android phones. You don't need to do this for copyright purposes. Every picture you're taking is automatically copyrighted according to law. However, if you want to add your name into a photo's metadata, perhaps to help somebody find your camera in case it's lost, I want to show you that on Wrench page 6, there's the copyright info page here. I always go in and enter my name here. You can tap this out with the touchscreen to make it a little faster. Add in your name, your phone number. These are a lot of menu settings and it's kind of hard to memorize where everything is. That's why I put my most frequently accessed menu items under the custom My menu here to the very far right. You can see by default, the only option available is Add My Menu tab. You'll need to create one or more tabs with your favorite menu settings. So I'll create My Menu tab 1, and then I can select Configure, select items to register. And now I can select the items that I use most often. For example, anti-flicker shoot is something I tend to turn on and off. You might use custom white balance. Go through, pick the options you regularly use, and then hit the menu button to back out a couple of times, and you'll see the options here. You can resort these by going back to Configure and then select Sort Registered Items. For example, let's put custom white balance on top. You can add multiple tabs just by scrolling over to 2 here, or you can delete tabs. If you have completely customized it, set it to display only My Menu tab, and now when you open up the menu, that's all you're going to see. That way you get a greatly simplified version of the Canon menu system. Now we're going to talk about recording video. Of course, we're going to hit the Mode button and then hit the Info button to get it into video mode. The R5 has a lot of different video options, so I want to go over them. Everything is under Camera page 1 for the most part. Check out Movie Record Quality for this incredibly confusing menu system. The first option here, Movie Record Size, lets you choose between 8K, 4K, and Full HD options at different frame rates. Full HD is generally 1920 by 1080. 4K is twice the X and twice the Y coordinates, creating 4 times as many pixels. It's 3840 by 2160. And then 8K is doubled each dimension again, creating 4 times bigger than 4K, or 16 times more pixels than Full HD. 8K is like 32 megapixels of data, 30 or 24 times a second. It's incredibly detailed video, and it's absolutely fantastic quality on the Canon R5. The video is absolutely amazing. Will people ever see this difference? We did a large poll with thousands of users, and we found no. People generally cannot perceive the difference between 8K and 4K video. Now you might say, okay, there's no reason for me ever to use 8K, unless you want to do in-camera crops. In-camera crops allow you to do a jump cut, where you cut from one camera to the same camera, but it doesn't look so much like a jump cut. It also allows you to sort of compose a shot in post. So you can shoot a little bit wide, rotate it to level it off, zoom in a little bit. This does create a visible difference. If you're shooting in 8K and you need to crop 200% to 4K, that will look much better than if you shoot at 4K and crop to 200%. So use 8K for those situations where you need that additional versatility. Be aware that 8K video burns through the battery very, very fast. You'll be lucky to get 15 minutes of recording time out of it, even after the latest firmware updates, because the camera will overheat and it will shut down. As you go through the movie record size settings, you'll see there's 3 different rows. The top row allows you to choose the resolution. We have 8KD and 8KU. You can see at the top the resolution. 8KD is 8192 by 4320. This is more movie aspect ratio. You know that super widescreen, which is letterboxed on your TV at the top and the bottom, that cinema wants to kind of use? It is a wider format cinematic option. This YouTube, most TV, 16 by 9. If you want to do that, you would film in 8KU. You can see that's not quite as wide. It's actually a little bit cropped. It doesn't go the full width of the frame. So if you're shooting at 50 millimeters in 8KU, it's going to be more like 55 millimeters. You have the same options for 4K. 4KD is wider than 4KU. And then you get down to full HD, which is always in 16 by 9. The second row here allows you to record the frame rate. You can see you can choose between 60 frames per second, rounded from 59.94, 29.97, basically 30 frames per second, or you can go down to 24 frames per second, which is like the cinema feel, or TV in places other than North America. Finally, the last option is the file format. Not all of these are available under full HD, but let's go to 8KD. And here you can see we have the option for RAW. RAW records a very, very large file that captures immense amounts of detail in the shadows and the highlights and allows you to adjust things in post-processing. If you go to import one of these files in Final Cut Pro on your computer or Premiere Pro, it should prompt you to install a plugin from Canon. So you can just Google 8K RAW plugin and make sure you have that installed for your video editing software. But I've used this in Final Cut and it allows me to drag it right in and it looks perfect. And then I get just this massive latitude when I need to recover the shadows and highlights for things like a real estate video where it's dark inside and bright outside, and I need to be able to balance that to show the inside-outside aspects of the shot. Very, very useful. But remember to record in the shortest possible clips because the file sizes are going to be unbelievable. The next option here is Light RAW, introduced in a later firmware update. If you don't see this, you didn't update the firmware like I recommended. This just produces a smaller file size with almost as much quality. Next, we have All I, which you should not use. It says for editing, but All I is just like a wasteful, sort of barely compressed format. It takes a bunch of JPEG pictures and just sticks them in a video file without using intra-frame compression. So it's just wasteful. And it's not, in my experience, any more editable than the much more efficient IPB option. IPB is just like a standard video file where frames are compared against each other and the compression can be much more effective because of that. The last option here is Light IPB. So if you're running out of storage space with IPB, try out Light IPB because it'll consume less storage space, it'll let you record for longer on a given memory card, and the quality is probably good enough, especially if you're publishing to YouTube or something. You don't need all that quality, right? Believe it or not, just to make this more confusing, there are other quality options. Check out 4K HQ mode on the movie record quality. If you enable this, you get better 4K quality video, but you're limited to 4K at 30 frames per second. You can no longer do 60 frames per second. The difference here is 4K high quality mode captures an 8K frame and then scales it down in camera and writes that 4K video. It does produce a sharper, higher quality video than standard 4K, which is what they call line skipped, where not all the pixels are red. Or maybe it's pixel binned. Either way, 4K high quality does produce higher quality video, but it eliminates the option for 4K 60 frames per second and is much more processor intensive on the camera, and thus overheating will happen much faster. So as a result, I only use 4K high quality mode when absolutely necessary. If you want to do slow motion, you can enable high frame rate here. So I'll set this to enable, and now you can see it's going to record 4K at 120 frames per second. I can also choose 4K U or go to full HD at 120 frames per second. If you're publishing at 30 frames per second, it's 4 times slow motion. If you're publishing at 60 frames per second like this, it's 2 times slow motion. If you decide to record in 8K RAW, you have the option to record a proxy file. Those 8K RAW files can be really big. Your computer will not be able to process it in real time when you're editing it. Thus, I always have to create a proxy file. Now, Final Cut, Premiere, they'll both do that automatically on import if you set that option. So look up how to do that. But to save yourself that extra processing time, you can record a proxy file in 4K to the SD card slot while the 8K RAW writes to that CF Express Type B card. To set that option, you'll want to go to the wrench icon, page 1. And the first option there, record func and card select. Now under video record options, you'll see this third option here. RAW to the first card, MP4 to the second. That MP4 file on the SD card is the proxy file. You would need to copy both of those separately to your computer and then point your video editing app at the proxy file. I find it easier not to do that and to just generate the proxies on the computer. You should be aware of Canon Log, C-Log, which is a technique for capturing more dynamic range without having to record a big RAW file. Basically, it creates a very flat, low contrast image that has more detail in the highlights and shadows, more detail than you would typically show in a video. But if you did want to show all those highlights and details later, for example, compressing the highlights and raising the shadows so that you could do an indoor-outdoor shot. To get to that, go into the menus, go to the camera page 3, and you'll see Canon Log settings. Select this, turn it on, and now you can choose between C-Log and C-Log 3. There's no reason to use C-Log. You can use C-Log 3. Only use C-Log if you need to match other cameras that are only using C-Log. If you don't see C-Log 3, again, install the latest firmware update. You should also configure the sound recording on this camera to capture some kind of audio, even if it's just scratch audio. But if you do hook up an external microphone, you want to make sure you adjust the levels because they might be too loud or too quiet. So under camera page 1, the last option here, sound record. You can see it picking up my voice now. Auto is almost never the right option because in moments of silence, it will crank up the volume because it's not hearing anything. And if you try to play that back, you'll just hear moments of silence where the background noise goes like a big whoosh. So you almost always want to set this to manual. And then you can go down to recording level and adjust this up or down. Usually I want to set it down to the point where if somebody speaks loudly, it just briefly touches the yellow. Because if you have it too high, those peaks will be clipped and that cannot be recovered. But if it's too low, you can always raise it. So it's better to be a little quiet than a little too loud. The Canon R5 has amazing sensor stabilization for both stills and video. There are many times when I'm able to handhold a shot and have it look like I was shooting it on a gimbal. It's that good. Just make sure if the lens has built-in sensor stabilization that the lens stabilization option is turned on. You do not need to turn it off on a tripod. Stills or video. It seems to automatically detect those situations and it only does good things. So I've never had to turn it off. There is a second option for video called electronic stabilization. When you're in video mode, go to camera page 7 and you can see image stabilizer mode here. It's not allowing me to change the option right now. However, if I go back and change the video quality to something more reasonable, we can see digital IS is an option now. Digital IS is not sensor stabilization. Digital IS uses the camera's gyro in there to detect these movements and actually crop and rotate the video a little bit to provide additional stabilization. You might not need this, but if you're running with the camera and you really want to make it as stable as possible without having to apply stabilization in post, you can go in here and set this to either on, which provides a little bit of a crop, or enhance, which provides even more of a crop. It's going to change your focal length. So maybe you'll go from 24 millimeters to 30 millimeters and then 35 millimeters with enhanced. So you don't want to use it unless you absolutely have to. But for those times when you need the extra stabilization, it's there. Another video-centric option is zebras. Zebras highlight overexposed parts of the frame. So go to camera page 7 and then go down to zebra settings and turn it on. You can see there are different patterns that you can experiment with. Let's set it to zebra 1 and 2 so we can see the difference. Here it's going to display zebra level 1 pattern at 70% exposure. So not quite full white. It's just like a warning this part of the frame might be overexposed. Zebra level 2 will appear at 100%, where that part of the frame is definitely overexposed and the highlights are going to be clipped. Look at this, and as I raise the exposure using exposure compensation, there you can see the zebra pattern 1 coming on as that part of the frame at the bottom starts to get close to overexposed. Now, as I raise the exposure and exposure compensation, you can see it will eventually hit 100%, and now we can see the zebra pattern 2 coming on to show things that are completely overexposed. Pros use zebras a lot. I actually find the regular screen without the zebras is good enough for me to know when things are overexposed or not. Time lapses are really useful for showing the passing of time or for cool establishing shots in a video. Earlier I showed you how to use the interval timer to create high quality time lapses that capture a sequence of still photos that you would need to process later. This captures at higher resolution, and you can capture raw files, so you could recover the highlights and the shadows, and that can be really important for time lapses where the sun might move in and out of the frame, and thus that dynamic range is necessary. Maybe you're just a vlogger though, you want to just get a quick time lapse without having to do any post-processing. Put it into video mode and then go to this time lapse option, Camera Page 5 Time-Lapse Movie. I have it connected to HDMI, so I can't do it right now. But the settings there are just like the interval timer, except it's going to capture a video frame and save it to a video file instead of saving still images. You have the option to record HDR videos, where it will automatically compress the highlights and the shadows. I do not recommend doing this. I've had bad experiences where it just looks bad. So what I would do instead is to capture in either C-Log 3 or, for the best quality, capture in 8K RAW and handle the compression of highlights and shadows in your video editing app. This wraps up the tutorial part of this video. I want to do some quick suggestions for flashes and tripods. I'm not going to go through lens suggestions because all the Canon RF lenses are really good. You pretty much get what you pay for. Like the 28-70 f2 is better than the 24-70 f2.8, but it's also more expensive, bigger and heavier, and doesn't go to 24 millimeters. I will point out the one non-obvious suggestion is the Canon 800mm f11, which is an amazing wildlife lens, and it's like $800. And people think it's not going to be good because it's f11, but it actually does great in low light. It does great for action. We just love the lens, and it's an incredible value. As far as flashes go, I never recommend the Canon flashes. Okay, maybe if you have Canon Professional Services and you just want to not have to deal with any other support, go for it. They work fine. But we use the entire Godox system of wireless triggers because it allows us to use wireless flashes, on-camera flashes, and a variety of different studio strobes within a single system, not just for our Canon cameras, but for other cameras too. And it works just as well as the Canon system at a tiny fraction of the price. For example, the Godox V862C is a wireless system that competes with Canon's top-end flash, but it's only $225 with the trigger. So is it as reliable as the Canon? I don't know. They have both failed on me at different times. I will say the Godox support is terrible, but I could buy like 3 of the Godox flashes and keep them in my bag as opposed to just one Canon. So that's what I do. I just buy extra flashes, and if they fail, they fail. For our studio strobes, we also use the Godox system. In the US, they might be known as Flashpoint, though you can also find them as Godox. I will say I no longer recommend the Pro bodies because the batteries are very unreliable. Instead, I would just get the standard Flashpoint or Godox studio strobes in the power output that you need. They have 400, they have 600. You can choose from manual versions or versions with TTL if you need that. If you don't know what those terms mean, check out my photography buying guide that I talked about earlier. To pick this up, head to sdp.io/Godox Canon. Now my suggestions for a tripod, especially a travel tripod. I really like the Manfrotto Be-Free tripod. It's not the most expensive travel tripod, but we have used it for most of a decade, and it's been absolutely fantastic. So check it out at sdp.io/Be-Free. We also really like the Gitzo stuff. Like if you are really into the texture of things, if you like luxury items, the Gitzo system simply feels better. It holds your camera. It does a good job at all the basic stuff, just like less expensive tripods do, but it's just nice. So check out the Gitzo Series 1. That's what we take when we're feeling fancy. And for the quick release plate, check out the Sony quick release plate at this URL here. I know it's not a Sony camera, but the quick release plate fits on perfectly, and because it has this little lip here, it stops the quick release plate from rotating and keeps it locked on better. Anyway, I highly recommend this system. Real world experience, it works great. And of course, head to northrup.photo, where we have stuff on sale right now. All of our photography education training that will help support this channel. Long tutorials like this that have completely blown my voice out. Buy our book, Stunning Digital Photography. Buy several and give some to friends. It's the #1 photography book in the world. Go to Amazon and check out the reviews. More than 5,000 5-star reviews there. People have loved it for a long time. It's continuously updated. I just updated it in 2020 to accommodate all the latest mirrorless cameras, things like smartphones and drones, the entire workflow for amateur and professional photographers. And as you get more serious, check out our art and science of photography training, which goes more in depth than we can go to in YouTube, and our professional portraits training, which has things like contracts and legalese, as well as techniques to help you not just take great portraits, but sell them and make money with your camera gear. We promise it works, or we'll give you your money back. We have technical and creative presets that help you extract more dynamic range out of your photos, automatically reduce noise in sky and wildlife photos, but also give you creative tones that allow your pictures to look better with just a couple of clicks. And of course, books on Lightroom Classic for organizing and editing your photos, and for more serious editing, Photoshop. These are not just books, these are video books, each with more than 10 hours of video training, each with hands-on practices and files that you can use to actually get practice. And of course, the photography buying guide, which has all the details of things like what exactly rolling shutter means, how to assess the contrast of your lens, and which lenses are going to be better for which types of work. Please do check all those out at northrup.photo, and of course subscribe. That's completely free and helps support us. And if you have more tips for using your Canon R5, write a comment down below. Thanks and bye.